As we get into this idea of rethinking, I like to read, and I occasionally will buy a book just based on the title. Don't know anything about it going in, maybe have heard of the author, maybe not. And one such book a few years ago was a book called Who Moved My Pulpit? And I thought, well, that's a funny title. I've got to see what this is about. And basically, it was a book about the struggle of sometimes doing things differently or changing within church. And by the way, I should preface all of this with, there is no planned change that I'm aware of. Everybody gets nervous. There's nothing on the horizon this is prepping you for. It's this hidden mark, and we're talking about it, so we'll talk about it. But this book, Who Moved My Pulpit, was about a preacher who would come into a church, and this church had a gigantic pulpit. The way he described it, I wish there would have been a picture, but it was just this huge thing. When I was a youth intern in Valdosta, Georgia, a long time ago, there were two pulpits. There was one pulpit that was kind of like this, probably a little bit bigger, that was kind of a little further closer to the audience. And there was another pulpit that was a couple levels up that everyone at the church jokingly called the papal pulpit. And no one ever stood there. There was one elder who had been an elder for like 30 years, and if he was the guy doing announcements or prayer, he would go up to that one. All the sound guys would start to scramble trying to remember what that microphone was to turn it on, but no one ever used it. And when this guy in Who Moved My Pulpit came into the church, he thought, I need a different pulpit because I'm not that kind of a pulpit guy. And so he talked to church leadership, and they kind of agreed with where he was at. And so one Saturday they came in and they moved the old pulpit and they put it back in a classroom somewhere, and they put the new pulpit out that was probably a little more the way he described it, kind of like what we've got here. And when he came in Sunday morning, the new pulpit had disappeared and the old one was back. And he had no idea how it got there. And so he went ahead, and it was too late to do anything that Sunday, so he went in and preached. And then the next Saturday, he came in again and moved the old pulpit into a further away classroom and put the new one out. And he came in Sunday morning, and sure enough, there it was again. And for a few weeks this happened until finally, I think the old pulpit actually left the grounds, and no one could find it at that point, and the new one kind of took. We struggle with things being different. We struggle with change. We struggle with those ideas. And because of that, as much as we get frustrated with the Pharisees and the scribes and some of the religious leaders we read about in the Gospels, I hope we also might have a little bit of patience to realize there can be a little bit of us in there when we're not careful. When we get so caught up in how things are supposed to be or how we're accustomed to them that we don't really see what the bigger picture is that's going on. So as we look at Mark chapter 2, we're going to look through it kind of through this lens. In the book Jesus the King, the author says, there is a code of conduct. This is the way the Pharisees and the scribes and the religious leaders of the time saw the world. There's a code of conduct, and if you follow it, God will look upon you with favor. But these kinds of religious systems, they all have the same logic. If I perform, if I obey, I'm accepted. And I don't know about you, but there have been times where I've kind of viewed my relationship with God in that way. That if I check all the boxes, if I do all the right things, then God will accept me. And we don't stop and think about, well, the flip side of that is, if I don't perform to my best, which at times I don't, if I don't do all the things exactly so, then God is not going to be accepting of me. The gospel of Jesus is not only different from that, but diametrically opposed to it. I'm fully accepted in Jesus Christ, and therefore I obey. So we're not doing all of these things to try to gain favor. We're doing these things because we have favor. God has already looked on us, accepted us, if you've been baptized into Him, if you have chosen to follow Him. And because of that, we do things differently than we would otherwise. So it's not to say it's a life of no rules. There are still rules. There are still things we are to do, things we're not to do. But the reason for that is totally different. It is not in hoping that God will be okay with us. It's because God has accepted us that we do those things. So we're going to think about Mark 2, the second half, especially here, in terms of what the code of conduct is that the Pharisees and the scribes see, and how Jesus is going to show them something a little different than what they're accustomed to. So we're going to begin by backtracking a little bit. It says in verse 16, and you'll remember last week we ended here, but last week we looked at the calling of Levi or Matthew. Matthew is a tax collector, not liked by the people around him, and Jesus calls him to be a disciple. And then they go to eat a meal, and there are all these tax collectors and sinners there, is the way the Pharisees and the scribes put it. And in verse 16, it says, the scribes of the Pharisees, when they saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, said to his disciples, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? So the code of conduct for the scribes and Pharisees is people matter, but not in the way that we might say that people matter. It's more in the sense of which people you are around and you're seen with are very important. And if you are seen with or around the wrong kind of people, then that's not okay. Now, the struggle that I hope we can see in that is it's going to be hard to reach people for Jesus if we can't be around them. It's going to be difficult to find people who are not following Jesus if we're not around people who are not following Jesus. And I will tell you, by the way, as a preacher, this is probably one of my greatest struggles because I'm around you guys for the most part, and you guys are at least trying to follow Jesus, and because of that, I'm not always around the tax collectors and the sinners that Jesus is around like that. And I have to remind myself that there are other people out there that need to hear. But for them, when they see people, they see categories, they see problems, they see the ones you should be avoiding. But Jesus says in verse 17, it says, when Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. So Jesus, in his code of conduct, sees people in a different way. He sees people and says that sinners still matter to God. So all of those people that from time to time we may be guilty of seeing a group of people that is trying to push an agenda within our culture. And you start to look at those people and you see those people differently than God sees those people. Is what they are doing often wrong? Yes. Is what they are doing often ungodly? Yes. Are they sometimes trying to push others in a way to make others accept those things? Absolutely. Does God stop valuing them because of that? No. Jesus is around these people who the society that he lived in would look at the same way that oftentimes we may look at the ungodly, and he chooses to go to those people because sinners still matter to God. So when you catch yourself, and I catch myself from time to time, starting to just cast a wide array of things about people, a lot of stereotypes, a lot of judgments, remember that whoever it is that you're thinking of or talking about, those people still matter to God every bit as much as we do. And although we're following him now, what God would like is for them to begin following him at some point. And the in-between for that, it's us. If they're ever going to begin to follow, it's our influence, our telling them about Jesus that can do that. So sinners still matter to God. Then in verse 18, it says that now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people came to him and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? You ever get this kind of conversation in our world today? You know, why do those people do that and you do this? And we try to kind of draw these lines and barriers between one another. Why are John's disciples doing the things that we think you should do, and your disciples are not doing those things? So for them, an important part of the code of conduct is fasting. Now here's where things begin to separate just a little bit, because our assumption would be that their code of conduct, the Pharisees and the scribes, because they are the ones who have literally written Scripture down and copied it over years and years, so probably know it pretty well. And the Pharisees, who seem to be the ones trying to practice it really well, although it's more letter of the law than spirit of the law, that if they think fasting is important, that all must be built around the law. And yet what we learn when looking at the Old Testament is it's not. There's a little more to it than that. Fasting in the Old Testament looked like this, and it's just kind of a brief aside here. The commanded fasting in the old law, when you go back to Leviticus and all of the law that was given out, is just the Day of Atonement. That's it. They have one day a year where there is a commanded fast. And then at some point they go into exile, 586 BC if you care. But at some point they go into exile, and they begin, as they come out of exile, to realize how far they've come from God. And one of the solutions to that is more fasting, which is probably not a bad idea. It focuses them a little more. There's a little more to it. So they come up with 4 other fasts after exile that come along. And then in the book of Esther, we learn about the Feast of Purim, when all the Jews were going to be killed because of the thing that Haman had convinced the king to do. And then Esther was able to save them. God was able to save them through what Esther does. and then they have a feast to recognize that. So they have gradually added all these other fasts, and then we reach the time of the New Testament, and the Pharisees are now fasting twice a week. So the one time in the law is not enough, the 4 additional times that came after exile are not enough, the Feast of Purim added by Esther is not enough. Now they're going to do it twice a week, which again, fasting twice a week is probably not a bad idea, but when you have created this thing, and then John's disciples have also done this thing, and you look at Jesus' disciples and they're not, and they say, well, why are they not doing this thing? And forget, well, you created this thing in the first place. We would never be guilty of anything like this nowadays, would we? I mean, we've had moments along the time in our history where we have become so engrossed in something that it's hard to let loose of that thing. We got a call in the church office this week from Chris Wells. And you may not know this, but Chris Wells, in a box in a closet somewhere, has a box of songbooks. And they are, and it's so funny the way that Dana described this to me, they're the green books. I have no idea what the green books are. I've seen lots of different color songbooks of different publications and all of that, but at some point, this church used green books, I'm assuming. And at some point, I don't know if there was an in-between step, but somewhere along the way, you now have the blue ones that are on the racks in front of you, and then at some point past that, it's on the screens and you hardly ever pick up the books. And I would guarantee you at every one of those steps, there's a little bit of, I'm not so sure about this. And the reason I tell you that is because I need a pep talk when I'm going into the mall to buy a suit for my son. I don't do change well either. And we have begun to institutionalize a lot of those things that are just good, fine, but not necessarily command. This is where the Pharisees begin to really struggle. So why do your disciples not do this thing that everyone else is doing? But Jesus doesn't take it on head on in that way. He doesn't just dismantle going back to the Old Testament and explaining to them where the fasting came from and all of that. He says this. He says in Matthew, and I think it's good for us to be reminded that Jesus does believe in fasting, and this is a thing he talks about. In Matthew, he says, when you fast, don't look gloomy like the hypocrites. By the way, likely the people that he's talking about right here that are having this discussion with him. For they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. We picked up at the Men's Warehouse yesterday a suit coat. And these are separates, by the way, because the groomsmen just wear the pants and not the whole suit. We picked up a suit coat, and Nathan loved it, and it fit really well and all of that. And when he took it off, I looked at the price tag that was on the sleeve, and it was $450 for a suit coat. We didn't buy this one, by the way. I looked at it, and I may have needed resuscitation for a moment there, because I thought I've never owned anything to wear that cost $450. But luckily, the pants didn't fit well, so I was rescued. But anyhow, when I saw that, my wife immediately saw the expression on my face. And I was thinking again about this. These guys fast, and suddenly you can tell. You know, they look sad and like they've just. And the Pharisees, if you read a lot about the first century church and the Pharisees and all of the struggle that was going on there, the Pharisees were known for kind of looking the part. Like they would look maybe a little disheveled, not because they didn't have means, but because that was the look they were trying to go with. So Jesus says, don't do this to be seen. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, get up, take a shower, brush your teeth, do the things you would do for a normal day, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Jesus does teach about this. And he follows up in Mark, where we were in verse 19, by saying, Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. Now for us, and again, I'm kind of in wedding mode with this whole story and with going shopping yesterday. For us, the way weddings generally work is you have all this lead up to it, and then you have your rehearsal dinner ahead of time, you have the wedding ceremony and a reception, and then it's done. The bride and the groom, they go somewhere on their honeymoon. Everybody else goes back to regular life. You say a prayer that they've done the pictures ahead of time so you don't have to wait for the cake, all of that stuff. For them, in their culture, this feast went on for a week. There wasn't the honeymoon like we have where the bride and groom leaves. The bride and groom, they stay. And they're a part of this celebration. So when Jesus explains this, they get it. They get the idea that why would we have fasting when the bridegroom and the bride, they're still here and we're having this celebration? In the Barclay commentary, William Barclay says, all in attendance at one of these weddings on the bridegroom are relieved of all religious observances which would lessen their joy. So the rabbis, when these things were going on, actually had kind of put an edict out of the Sabbath is on hold while this wedding feast is going on. You don't have to worry about all of that stuff. You can just enjoy the celebration. So Jesus says, I'm the bridegroom and I'm here, and enjoy the celebration while I'm here. Then in verse 20, he says, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. So fasting for Jesus is a reminder that being seen is not the purpose of this. Fasting had a purpose. And when we look at all of those different Old Testament fasts, the main focus of it was, one, to remember what God has done, and two, to remember that He is the one that provides. It is not through what we do, it's what God is doing. So don't get so caught up on whose disciples are doing this and whose aren't that you forget why we're doing this in the first place. It isn't to check a box on Monday and Thursday for the Pharisees, or 5 times a year after the exile, or once a year back in the old law. It's because of what God is doing. It doesn't have anything to do with any of these other things. Then he says in verse 21, no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. In the Expositor's Bible Commentary, he explains Jesus' little short parables here this way. Jesus' point is that the coming of the kingdom represents a new work that God is doing. Jesus is not merely promoting a reform movement within Judaism. Rather, his coming is the turning point of human history. It marks the transition from the age of promise to the age of fulfillment. Everything has changed. Everything has changed. And for the Pharisees and the scribes and all of the other religious leaders that Jesus will encounter, that is one of the hardest things to get around. Everything has changed. Verse 23. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? So for the Pharisees, a big piece of the code of conduct is the Sabbath. I mean, that goes all the way back to the 10 Commandments. Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. This is the thing that's very important to them. But again, it had become a thing that they had just kind of legislated to death. There was, and I feel like we've talked about this before in here, but just to remind you, there was a thing within this time called the Sabbath day journey. And what they would figure out is who in the synagogue lived farthest away, who near the temple lived farthest away that would have to get there for the Sabbath. And that became a distance that you could travel. So if this were the place you had to go, and you came here from Kanawha this morning, you would be our distance that we could travel. So since I don't live as far as Kanawha, that means I have some play. I can get here and back, and I've only gone half your distance, so now I have another 10 or 15 miles that I can journey during the day, and it's okay because it fits within what they called the Sabbath day journey. Do you think that was God's intent back in Exodus chapter 20 when he's writing on stone tablets for Moses? That we would try to decide how many miles was enough miles and when would it be okay and when would it not? Do you think his intent was people in New York City today have trouble in elevators in high-rises that are Jewish because pushing the button is work? And so they may stand at an elevator, and as people walk by, they will say, "Are you Jewish?" If you're ever in New York City, I've heard of this happening, by the way. And if you are not, then you are the savior of the day because you can push the buttons and then get back to their floor. Think God ever intended that? And I'm not trying to mock that, but it's the tendency we have to do things. And so the Pharisees here are concerned with, well, this is the Sabbath, if this is not when those things are supposed to happen. And he said to them, have you never read what David did? And if you want to, you can go back and see this, and I believe it's in 2 Samuel, if I remember right. David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And you can go back to Leviticus and read all about that. It's not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and gave it also to those who were with him. So there was a time where David came along, and because he and his men were hungry and in need of food, they did something that was not according to the way the law was put out in the first place. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So in Jesus' eyes, the Sabbath was about a couple things. Maybe I'm simplifying it a little too much here. It was partly about remembering what God did in creation. It's partly remembering about how God provides. But a piece of this is God understands you were built for rest. You ever do too much for too long and it just hits you sometime? You ever have college students who might be among us, you ever have those times, or even high school students, junior high students, where you have stayed up doing homework or studying or whatever it is, and then you finally hit a day where you don't want to get out of bed. Maybe every day's like that, I don't know. But you hit a day where you feel that way. You've worked too hard. I'm not retired yet, but I will tell you, every time I do something incredibly physical in nature, I feel it. And I feel older than I used to. God knows we're meant for rest, to the point that He makes it a law in the Old Testament. You have to take a day that's for rest. And we, because we're New Testament Christians, have kind of just let that go. I'm not saying we need to keep a Sabbath on Saturday or anything as they do in the Old Testament, but I believe that rhythm and pattern of rest is very real for us too. We have a need to have days that are for rest and times that are for rest. So He says, you've forgotten the point. You're worried about grains and picking them on a certain day. This was about rest. It was made for people. And then He says in verse 28, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And this will be the most difficult thing for them to get their heads around. This is a statement of authority. And in their mind, in their law, in their code of conduct, the authority was God, but the authority was also them. And when people have authority and power, there is a struggle with anyone who threatens that power. We see that unfold in our world daily in lots of different ways. The authority, when everything changes, part of what changes is the authority. And if you'll forgive me, I believe what Jesus is saying here is there's a new sheriff in town. There is someone different that you are now to look to. It's no longer about the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin. There is an authority that is here that is different than what has come before. And because of that, everything has changed. So this morning, in your life, God is a God of change. He is a God who changes lives, changes minds, changes hearts, and I believe He wants to do that for you today. He would like for you to be able to rethink the way that you do life. If you are not living for Him, or if you are living for Him in such a way that it is the way the Pharisees look at it, which is, I've got to do all these things just so to be accepted by Him, instead of the way Jesus looks at it, which is, because you are accepted by Him, you live in a different way. You obey, you respect, you love, you do things differently. This morning, if you have never followed Him, maybe it's because you have seen the Pharisees' version of Him instead of the real version of Him. I think our world looks at Him that way sometimes. Know that He's not like that. He is one who loves you desperately and wants you to come to Him. He wants you to be baptized into His Son and to rise and walk in a new life. Or if you have walked away from that for whatever reason today, know that you can come back. Jesus encounters people all along the way who change their lives. You can be one of those people today too. If there's some way we can help you, please come while we stand and sing.